Hey there, this is Chad from Zombie Fight Shark, and today we are going to do a deep dive on Versilian Studios Chamber Orchestra 2 Community Edition. So this is kind of a follow-up from a previous video, so if you haven't seen that, take a look at it. We're going to listen to a short 1-minute work before we get into the video and finding out how to get the best out of VSCO. So take a listen, enjoy, and I'll see you soon. Okay, thanks for listening to that. That piece is just a little bit unfinished because I didn't want to make it too long, so I kind of just had to put a stinger on the end and call it a day. But I think it gives you a pretty good idea of what you can do with VSCO. So we're going to start at the macro level and then get down to the micro level. So first, let's take a look at all the instruments there. So I've got several different sections. I did not use all the instruments that are in VSCO. I used the ones that were appropriate for this work, which was still a pretty big sound. And rather than using one instance of it, I've used multiple instances of instruments. So I have sections of all of these things that you see here, and even those I didn't use a ton, so I could have fleshed it out even more than I already did. So let's start in the strings, since for me that's where a lot of stuff frequently starts. So violins, there are two different violin sounds in VSCO, and if you take a look, it's listed as violin and it's listed as violin section. And so violins 1 and 2 here are violin, principal violin, violin sections are violins 1 and 2, and then principal violin is the other violin that I use there. In viola, I use two instances of the same viola sound. Same thing with contrabass, only I've got 3 of them in that case. In the cello, I have 4 instances of the cello. I didn't go as crazy with the woodwinds. I was honestly starting to get a little bit processing was a little bit of a problem at some points with this. So piccolo, flute, 2 flutes, an oboe, 2 clarinets, bassoon, and then in tubas, I actually did 2 different tubas, and I'm going to explain why I did a lot of this in just a second. Trombones, I did 2 trombones. And there actually is two different trombone sounds. There's an old trombone and a regular trombone section. And the old trombone, I tried to use it, but it was too unique. It's got a very unique sound. It's a little splatty in places. And it's meant to sound like an old trombone, because I guess it is. So it didn't work out to use, so I used just two of the regular trombone instruments. French horn, just one of those. Trumpets, I do have 2 trumpets. Within the trumpet sound itself, there is a sustain and then there is a vibrato version, and I messed around with alternating between those two to try to get different tones and different timbres, since that's using different samples. Because one of the things we talked about in our in the first VSCO video I did was, there's not a million different samples for these instruments for your velocity levels. So a lot of times you only have, it may be 3 or 4 velocity levels overall. So, but I'll get to that in a minute. Percussion, just use one instance of that and put it all on one track. Which was easy enough. Percussion actually ended up being one of my favorite things. I didn't think I was going to be too impressed with it, but after I got it in there, I thought, oh, this is pretty great. There's not a from what I could tell, it didn't seem like there were a ton of velocity levels from a lot of the percussion instruments, but it ended up not mattering as a supporting instrument. What's there is totally fine for a lot of work. And then glockenspiel, just because I love the glockenspiel, so I just had to throw it in there in a few places. So there's the instrumentation. So when we look at the cello, I've got 4 instances of the cello, and you have, you just have cello section. You don't have a bunch of options there in regards to having a principal and having a second, a third. And I did this same trick. I did it in different ways with the instruments, but the cello was, because I did 4 of them. I had to play this one close. I'm looking here, and here's my initial track, and you'll notice I did not quantize much of this. And you can kind of look at my velocity levels there and see, they're kind of up and down, a little bit normal. So then on my next cello, it might be quantized a little bit different. Velocity levels are pretty much the same. And this we might need to zoom in a little bit more on. So, and we'll try to A/B these so it makes even more sense. Then on my third one, you can see I lowered the levels a little bit because what I was trying to do is trigger a different sample. Because even though it's a quieter sample and it may not have as much attack for what I was doing here, it changes the timbre and starts to sound more like a section instead of the same thing over and over. And then in the last one here, you can see my velocity levels, I raised them all up to try and trigger a different sample. So in theory, what I've done with all 3 of them is hopefully I've got 3 different samples going all at the same time. And an easy trick, I didn't actually do it here because it wasn't necessary, but if you're using an instrument and your velocity levels are like, you're doing what I'm doing here. You only have one instrument and you're trying to get the best out of it. So you could bump your volume up. Like, let's just say I talked about it in one of my other videos, giving character to your digital performer. And so let's say the character, this is the way to get the best out of it. You say this guy plays soft all the time, or this instance of the cello section, they're the soft cello section. So they can play soft. You make all their velocity levels soft, and then you're going to bump up your levels individually on your fader. So even though they're playing soft all the time, doesn't matter. You've bumped up the volume level, and you just have to be attentive to the fact that that's the soft section whenever you're writing. So that's one little trick to get the best out of everything. Another one is, like, if you look at this and we look closely, you can see this is all quantized pretty much dead on, because I had when I was making these sections, I would quantize one section, and then another section I would let it be loose. Another one would be behind. Another one would be ahead. And so like this one, when we zoom in, you can see a lot of this is ahead of the beat. So this was probably the section I actually pushed it forward, or I didn't quantize it at all because I tend to record a little bit ahead of the beat. This one partially quantized. Let's see. Okay, on the bottom cello here, let's zoom into that one, and it's kind of on the beat, ahead of the beat. You got some things that are behind the beat a little bit, so a little bit different. And again, you're using the same attacks, the same it's the same instrument, same samples. So, but by moving ahead behind number one, it's humanizing your performance. Because if you've ever played in a large ensemble, even in a section, everybody's never dead on. Nobody's that good, and it doesn't sound as good when everybody's dead on. So you can have world-class players, and there's always going to be very slight variation between your performances, even in a duet. So those little and we're talking about milliseconds, but those milliseconds are what make it sound like two people playing at once. So an easy trick, and then on top of that, add your velocity changes to it, and there you suddenly have a section. And one of the other things, I think I did this a lot in the tubas. So tubas, it's not a tuba. So here's another example of pretty much the same thing. It's like, see, this is the quiet tuba player. He's playing gently and softly. And then the other tuba player, he's a little bit louder. So it's not a big difference, but it's a difference. And you can see I see this one is quantized. Everything's spot on the beat. And then this guy, he's a little bit ahead of the beat. So those are, again, like these are the tricks, you know. So you're on a budget. You got VSCO, and you're trying to get the most out of it. So use these little tricks, and it gets you a long way. And this is not a new thing, but it's worth mentioning. Make sure that you're playing with all your different articulations. So it's I'll be honest, I'm pretty lazy. So one of the things that I don't like doing is going back and triggering all my individual articulations. With any instrument, that's really important. With VSCO, it's especially important because of decay times for instruments. Because not all of the instruments don't always hang over. I'm using the Big Cat version of VSCO. So you have to set your entire note length. And if you don't set your note length correctly, you end up with weird truncated notes. And that goes hand in hand with actually setting your articulations correctly. So make sure you're doing that. And then, like I'd mentioned, in the case of the trumpets, there are two different trumpet sounds. Pull that up. There's a vibrato option, and then there is a sustain option. So using those, they're two different samples. So using those gets you more for your money. And the goal is you're just milking it. You're just milking these samples for everything you possibly can. Then last, in percussion, if percussion, the way it's set up there, you can use one track and just do everything on one track if you want. And when you look at it, it is it's set up pretty logically. It can get confusing if you have a percussion heavy piece. So this was not percussion heavy. I was just trying to sprinkle it here and there for flavor. So your call on that one. If you want to add a lot, just like the glockenspiel, I just threw it in there because I love glockenspiel, and it's just for flavor and taste, just a little bit of something different. As far as instrumentation goes, not a whole lot more to discuss there, because the things I've talked about, I did those in the entire piece, and just sort of worked them in and out, time permitting. There are a couple of quick runs in this where that was like so. Here's a quick run in violin, and that you have to play those close and be careful with them, and you can see like say a little bit ahead, a little bit behind, different velocity level, a little bit even further behind, higher velocity level. So if you're doing quick runs with VSCO, one of the things I noticed was they can start to sound like MIDI if you're not careful, particularly if they're woodwind heavy. It seemed like that was a little problematic with the woodwinds. So just this last run I thought came out really good. There's one in the middle that didn't come out so great. That you just kind of have to finesse. If you're doing a lot of quick runs with your instruments, make sure to experiment with your different articulations, because sometimes you got to use a staccato, even though technically it's not a staccato run, just to get the sound of each instrument coming out correctly, and articulate the run the way it should sound. So just because it says staccato, don't take that to heart, because what your ears hear is ultimately all that matters. So one note on the on mixing, and so I had grouped everything in here into my different sections, because it was just getting silly quickly. But some of the instruments are definitely, they project more and they're quite loud and they cut through. So like oboe, for example, here, like I've turned it down quite a bit because the oboe seriously cuts. Like even at a lower velocity level, it still cuts through the orchestra. And I found that it's not just a VSCO thing. I found that in most libraries. And that's why a lot of times there's only one oboe in an orchestra. Number one, tuning, and number two, they just cut. They cut through everything because they have this really narrow bandwidth that they live in. And so just something to be aware of, that some of your instruments are going to be a little bit more aggressive. Like the French horn here, see, I turned it down a little bit too, because usually don't get that quite so much with other libraries, but in VSCO the French horn really cuts. So, and then my glockenspiel is another one, because narrow bandwidth. There's not much else in that range. It's got a very aggressive attack even when played gently, and it's way up there. So everything's kind of getting out of its way. And then you probably noticed I've panned everything, and just to emphasize my sections. So like violin section 2, violin section 1, and sort of stuck to the way, if you were in the orchestra, the way it would be panned is how I tend to do it. Some people like it if you're looking at it, that's how they pan it. Some people do the reverse, as if you were in it. But that panning really makes a difference. Even in the case of like contrabass, your kind of standard mixing rules are, bass instruments are pan center. So if you're looking at the orchestra, contrabass would be over on the right-hand side, your contrabass section. So I put them all on the right-hand side. And then the cellos, they're usually pretty close to that. There's different arrangements, so it doesn't have to be this way. I just like this way. That was the way the orchestra was set up when I was in an orchestra. So that's the way I go with. That makes a big difference, again, in your final product. And then it is worth mentioning that I do have it's turned off right now, but a reverb, using H reverb from Waves, and put that on the whole orchestra. And after I had written everything, and I was like, this sounds okay. And then I started playing with reverb, and as soon as I dropped that one on there and put it into a hall, once you put it into that context, number one, all of the panning sort of came to life, and all of my harmonics started to mix a little bit better. So it's on the master track, and this is in Ableton. It's default setup in Ableton, but it's on the master track, not the reverb track. Which, if I was smart, that's probably how I'd do it. But I knew I wanted an equal amount on everything, so I put it on the master track instead of sending it like you traditionally would. So that's it. That's some VSCO deep dive. I hope that opens up some doors and windows for you. I hope you get some ideas to improve the quality of your orchestral writing using, honestly, it is one of the best free orchestras out there. And if you spend the time to finesse it, it goes from good to great. So yes, you can drop $10,000 and get something better. But the difference from great to film quality, it costs a lot to go from where this is to go to that level. And if, let's say, for example, you were to put this with some film with action on top of it, I honestly would hold this against a lot of other things that cost a lot of money, because I think that if you spend the time on it and work it right, and your composition is good, you have to put the work in there too, then you're going to be totally satisfied with your final product. So thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to hear more about this or a follow-up video, and I'll see if I can't create one if there's something specific in here that I missed or you want to hear more about. So thanks for watching. Cheers.